Welcome to the Leadership Melting Pot. My name is Romeo Fs. I'm the founder and CEO of Lumerous, who are the producers of this podcast. And I'm very excited about the topic today. On today's episode, we'll be diving into a topic that is shaking up the business landscape in the UK, the new consumer duty regulations. If you think about it, in a climate where, consumer expectations are higher than ever and regulatory pressures are intensify, business faces the challenges of not only meeting these new standards, but pretty much exceeding them. And stakeholders are demanding that businesses exceed these expectations. So this transformative, what I would like to consider as transformative regulation, is set to reshape how companies interact with their customer, demanding a shift from mere compliance to one of being far more proactive and far more customer-centric in the way how they treat customers and really, frankly, building their strategy. So as we navigate these uncharted waters, we will explore what the new UK consumer duty means for businesses and how it can be leveraged, not just for compliance, but for strategic advantage and to win new customers. To guide us through this complex terrain, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest, who I can say brings an immense wealth and insight into how businesses can adapt and thrive under the new consumer duty. Our super amazing guest today is none other than Dane Pedro. Welcome, Dane.
Thank you, Romeo. Good to be here. Thank you so much.
I'll never just tell people some of the things that you get up to, right?
Go ahead.
She's easily one of what I would consider one of the foremost experts on consumer duty. She is a seasoned compliance professional with a strong, track record in the financial services industry. For over 15 plus years, she has honed her skills and her expertise in guiding businesses of all sorts, from large corporates to startup through complex regulatory landscapes. And she has been one of the most in-demand persons nowadays for consumer duty. Her background include things like key roles at regulatory bodies such as the Financial Conduct Authority, the Financial Ombudsman, where she has provided, we've spoken about these lots of times, provided in-depth knowledge around consumer credit, e-money, and overall, consumer regulations and compliance. In addition to that, she is a magistrate. I didn't know this as well, and a presiding justice. And I think this just goes back to her overall ethos and passion around, ethical business practice and ethics in society and law and justice, so I can see the connection. She's also passionate about, mentoring and empowering others to create positive change. And she's a consummate learner. She was telling me how she just finished another study on governance, risk, and compliance. I'm like, what you studying for again? But anyway, Dane, welcome. How are you doing? Are you enjoying this great summer?
Well, I'm enjoying as much of the sun as I can get. I am trying not to complain that it's too hot, just embracing it, whilst we got it. So I'm doing okay, I'm still here, to see another day. So I'm good. And it's Friday, which is always a great thing, right?
Yeah, we shouldn't be complaining about summer because it's the first in a long time we've gotten weeks of good weather in the UK.
Absolutely.
During summer. So yeah, I'm thankful for that.
We've got to take it while we got it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I know it's taken everybody. It has taken us about 3 months to get Dana on the podcast, right? And it's not that she didn't want to do it. She wanted to do it, but she was so in demand that we had to reschedule 3 or 4 times. So I'm so glad that we finally been able to kind of pin her down for some time to have this very burning conversation. Again, so let's kick off with first thing I would like to say is, what is this new UK consumer duty regulation, and what are their intended purposes?
Okay, so it's so funny when you say news because it's kind of like, is it still new anymore? But what
Oh
is
boy.
it? So when you think about it, so consumer duty, what is it? Or the duty as it's affectionately known,
Oh yes.
sweet, yes, the duty, a suite of rules and guidance which all firms, financial services firms, are required to follow as of July of last year, July 31st to be exact. And what the duty
Yeah,
does, it's
already.
placing yes, so yes, it was a year. It's a year, a couple of weeks ago since the duty has been in force.
Mhm.
And what it's done is, what the intention is that it places a higher standard on firms to provide really good outcomes for their customers. So, we've always had the treating customer fairly outcomes that have been around sort of since 2004, 2006. But the duty is a lot more stringent, placing a lot more responsibility and the duty on care of all firms to be doing the best by their customers.
So how does this duty differ from the other kind of consumer protection laws and regulations that existed?
Well, what I would say, it's a lot more descriptive. It's so even though the
Uh,
duty in itself is quite broad, it's a lot more descriptive, a lot more prescribed in terms of what the FCA is expecting from firms. So I like to think of it with the duty, it's like split out into three elements where you've got the principle. So one of the things about the duty is developed a new principle. As we know, all firms that are licensed or authorized by the FCA, they automatically, when they are authorized, subscribe to these high levels or principles of business. Things like treating customers fairly, communicating in clear, fair, not misleading way, acting with integrity at all time, maintaining honest interactions with the regulator. And the duty produced another principle, Principle 12, or the Consumer Duty Principle. And that's the first principle to be added to the 11 that was already in place in over, I think, about nearly 20 years. So that's really showing the significance of the duty, these business principle. And then also you've got the cross-cutting rules, and you've got the outcomes. Because as we know, the regulators are a lot more outcomes based and really wanting to understand, are firms doing what they said they would be doing? It's not just a case of making money, but it's about the customer, right?
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, yeah. So the duty is very, very critical for lots of businesses, and I really feel that business really underestimated the impact of what the duty, it being in force, actually means for them, now and in the future.
All right, and we're gonna delve a little bit more into that, but we just realized that it's been a year. What is the
Yeah.
timeline for implementing, the key compliance requirements for businesses? What are
Right.
those timelines?
Yeah, so when the duty, so with any kind of FCA guidance, in new introduction of new guidance and rules, or enhancement, they always will go through that consultation period with a number of firms to kind of test the waters, right? And
Yep.
originally it was like thought that the FCA would only give firms maybe 7 months to implement. It wasn't very clear in terms of all the firms that would be caught under the duty, i.e., payment and e-money firms. But in July of 2022, the final rules and guidance were published, and the FCA gave firms a year. So from July 2022, the end of it, till July of last year. And in between that year period, there was other deadlines imposed by the FCA. For example, in October of 2022, where firms were required to put together an implementation plan. And what that plan in essence needed to do was really, look at all the various rules and guidance, and for firms to map in terms of the actions that they would need to do to look at their current business model and say, are we doing what the rules are stating that we should be doing as a business? If not, what are those gaps? Which departments does, those actions belong to? Who will be the action owners? And then obviously putting in those prescribed timelines to complete those relevant actions by July of last year. And then you had, in addition to that implementation plan, you had the assessment. So under the duty, firms have been required to assess whether or not they're a manufacturer of their products and services, whether they're co-manufacturers, whether they work with another firm or other firms, or they were just simply a distributor of their products and services. So there was a lot of work that firms had to do in the beginning, as well as appointing a consumer duty champion, which the FCA said should be at like board level, someone that can really influence and challenge the board. So you had a number of those different deadlines, and then you had April of last year where firms are required to have conducted all their assessments around their existing products, their open book products, as the FCA refers to. So there was a series of deadlines that firms had. And along the way, the FCA, what they've done is they've been publishing insights, you know, in terms of what they're seeing by way of good practices, bad practices. So like the implementation plan, what a good implementation plan should be containing versus what a poor one was actually looking like. So a series of deadlines with that deadline of July of last year. And then we've only recently had the July 31st deadline of this year, where all firms should have somewhere stored a lovely consumer duty board assessment, which literally gives that overall view of what firms have done, how they've done it, what actions they've taken, what MI they're using to track and monitor those customer outcomes, and ensuring that, you know, everything they're doing is aligning with the business strategy and vision overall. Because as we know, the FCA can and will be asking firms for them to share a copy of their board assessment, and they have to make it available within 48 hours. So that was just the recent deadline 2 weeks ago.
And from your, you know, you're dabbling in the space a lot. I mean, how do you think firms are coping, like, especially with that assessment? Would you say most of the firms have it done, or there people are still struggling?
I think a large majority of firms have done it. There are still some firms that are doing it. And I believe there is a small percentage of firms that haven't even started it. I really feel that, and through the various discussions and, you know, meetings and roundtables that I've attended and webinars, definitely with the Consumer Duty Board Assessment, that was a real challenge for a lot of firms, because the FCA gave very little guidance. There's no prescribed template, no prescribed format. So think about it. Whatever Consumer Duty Board Assessment firms have put together this year, it may change next year by way of structure, format, etc. And that definitely was a challenge. You know, some saw it as, you know, is it regurgitating what they really do in respect of other committees and governance committees that they've really got set up? You know, so a lot of firms will understand. And then the MI is a particular cause for challenge in terms of what MI is going to be sufficient to really demonstrate that they are acting to deliver those good customer outcomes. Yeah. So it's going to be really interesting when the FCA does request those board assessments from various financial services firms in different, whether it's from the insurance industry, whether it's, you know, retail or whatever, credit lending, and then they're going to then share those insights of what they've seen.
Yes, most definitely. But I'm hoping that, you know, the FCA would be, since the guidance in terms of how these were supposed to be conducted, they will probably use the next couple of months just to kind of, you know, iterate and help to kind of build out those guidances and don't come down too harshly on some of these businesses, because everyone is really trying to interpret it, and people are interpreting it in different ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. And what's really really useful to know, so on the 31st of July, the FCA actually did a webinar called 1 Year On from the Consumer Duty. And what they were saying, because, you know, one of the questions a lot of firms have been asking amongst themselves is, what will the FCA do? How will they enforce if they find out that a firm has breached you know, a requirement within the duty? And what they were actually saying is that they made not light of it. They actually emphasized that that's been a question of enforcement. And what they said is that it's not firms shouldn't necessarily be thinking in that way. It's more, and what they would be doing is taking a proportionate approach. So they'd be looking at what firms have done, and then they would be working. It's a lot more about a collaboration. It's not like getting a stick and saying this is wrong, but it's a collaborative and taking a proportionate effort. What they did say is, if, for example, the FCA got involved and they said to a firm, well, you need to do A, B, C, D, E, and then the firm then didn't do those actions, then they're going to come in a lot harder, right? Because the FCA was saying that we've interacted with a firm, we've seen what they've done, we've made suggestions, recommendations, we've given the firm X amount of time to do those, the firm hasn't, then they're naturally going to come down a bit harder.
And I would agree with them because, as we say in the UK, that means they're taking the piss, right? So,
Yeah, absolutely.
so listen, how does the consumer duty affect different industries? So, financial services, retail, all of those. How does it affect them differently?
Think like with financial services, it's around the different products and services in terms of how they're designing them, right? So so firms have had to look at look across their entire business model, look at all their products and service offerings, look at how they've been designed, you know, looking at whether or not there's been consideration, for example, customers that have characteristics of vulnerability, have those products and services been designed and taken into consideration those types of customers. And then I think from a retail perspective, even though I feel there's a crossover, it's that how customers are being treated, right? Are we treating them fairly? So going back to the treating customer fairly rules. And then when you're looking at the consumer duty, which talks about, acting to deliver good customer outcomes and treating customers and making sure that firms are meeting the needs and objectives and characteristics of those customers. So those are kind of like maybe the distinctions, but I would say in many ways there's so many crossovers in terms of what the duty is asking firms to consider. So looking at their product design, looking at their pricing, looking at the structure, looking at that offering, looking at the segmentation of those different customer types that they may have within their portfolio, and not just looking at existing customers, but also potential new customers as well.
Right, right. And how they kind of show up in front of those new customer base, etc. So I mean, what are so you spoke about, like, some of the changes that business need to make in order to comply with the new regulations. What are some of the challenges? And then we're going to probably talk about the opportunities. What are some of the challenges that you are seeing that businesses are facing in terms of implementing the duty?
I feel, and from what I've seen and heard, a lot of businesses underestimated the amount of work that was going to be needed to implement the duty. Because, as I said, initially firms were being told or hearing through the grapevine that it was going to be maybe 7 months to implement. Then when it was announced it was a year, naturally these days everybody thinks, oh, year is a long time. But as we know,
yes,
we're in the middle of August, and before we know it, the talk about Christmas is going to be,
I remember Christmas last year. I remember Christmas last year,
Exactly. So definitely it's a time. I think firms definitely underestimated the amount of time that it would take, even putting together the implementation plan, and also the amount of resource that it would take, because it's really needed that involvement of people from across various business areas, from your marketing teams to your tech teams to your customer service teams. So the amount of people that have had to become involved in, making sure that the duty has been implemented across the business. So yeah, definitely the time, the resources as well. And definitely, especially when you think about there's different types and sizes of firms. So maybe your smaller firms where they necessarily haven't had that resource, it's been a lot more challenging for them, versus the companies that have got a lot more resource, but there's a lot more, I don't know, levels of bureaucracy, complex, where you've got your global businesses and, the head offices in the UK, and then actually understanding the UK regulations. So there's so many things intertwined as well, and being able to, and also understanding it, because I feel that the rules and guidance are very broad in its application because they're designed to apply across the entire distribution chain. So firms interpreting it in, as you said, in their own way, definitely a challenge.
And it's also the whole notion of, like, I'm just thinking, some of the clients that we work with, it's like overall in your entire existing processes, because it also means a cultural shift within the organization. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as well. So I can just imagine how a lot of these organizations are really struggling where this is concerned. What are some of the opportunities though? Like, what have you seen any examples of benefits of companies, like, making these changes and they're saying, yes, you know what, this was worth it?
I feel that I think or some of the benefits is definitely that the culture. Culture is so key. Again, in that 1 year on webinar 2 weeks ago, the FCA talked about culture. So I feel like the duty, it being introduced at the time, was like a wake up call for firms who perhaps their culture was a little bit shaky, needed to be a lot more positive, because when you've got good culture, that's going to transpire into everything that a firm does by the way that they design products, the way that they offer that customer support, but the way that they communicate with customers. It's going to filter through to the staff and it's going to filter out to that end customer. So I feel definitely the benefits around is really enhancing, reviving, whatever word you want to use in terms of the culture of a company. And also what I've found is that I think working in compliance, I understand it, but people that are not working in compliance in business teams where they're working in marketing, for example, and they're not necessarily thinking about compliance in the way that we in compliance do, it's that education. So it's being able to educate colleagues across the business to say what you do. You do this job, you're employed to do this job, but when you look at the consumer duty and how it ties in, so really
Yes.
getting them to really understand it,
Yeah.
that's been, I think, will be one of the most biggest benefits, but it's also one of the most challenging ones to measure.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, you've touched on culture, and you spoke about the education piece. What are some of the other things that and I think that's one very critical component. But from your experience, what are some of the other things that businesses can do to help to create this culture that put consumer welfare as a priority, under the duty? Because I think that's what the duty is trying to drive to.
I think it's definitely because part of the implementation plan has been about looking across the entire business, a company's business model, looking at their policy, looking at their products, but also looking at their policies, their procedures, their processes. So being able to revamp them, enhance them, or think, well, the duty saying X, Y, and Z, we've got this platform, we've got this solution, it's not quite working. So we need to maybe stop doing that or reintroduce, make it a lot more better, introduce more technology, take advantage of the technology like AI, as we know, is growing, going. So being able to take advantage of those solutions out there to create a better customer experience for that individual firm. So I feel like I kind of look at the consumer duty as like literally like a massive gap analysis exercise where it's forced companies to look at the gaps in their business that perhaps they've been ignoring for such a long time, and it's now the opportunity to do better, to make things a lot more better, a lot more clearer, a lot more smoother, a lot more streamlined in terms of processes, get rid of some of the legacy systems that have been around for so many years and enhance them and make them a lot more lighter, much more easier and a lot more transparent. So, and also to help those internal stakeholders, the colleagues, to be able to do their jobs better, which then transfers out to those customers, giving those customers a better experience as well. So it's a complete overall, I would say.
That cultural piece, you're so right. That cultural piece is the linchpin for the success of consumer duty in any business, because it's like, one, if you don't get the team on board in terms of doing this, no matter the policies that you write and all of those infrastructure, they are the ones that will have to implement it anyway. And I can just see where, in order for, the employees to implement some of these things, you then have to look at, okay, ways of working for them, how do they show up, all of that kind of stuff, so it's really, as you said, a overhaul of the entire kind of systems and that's a big piece of job. Trust me, that's very transformative. Yes.
Absolutely.
What does it mean for businesses to, when the duty talk about a consumer centric or customer centric approach, what does that mean? What does that mean for business, and what does that mean for the end user or the consumer?
Well, what it means, when you look at the FCA's business plans as far as they go back, they always talk about putting the customer at the heart of your business. Always. Yes, we know businesses are there to be innovative, be the number one in the industry that they're in, the most competitive. and make money, but ultimately customers. Because if the business doesn't have any customers, they're not going to make any money. They're not going to
Exactly.
be able to invest in innovation and technology. They're not going to be able to take on staff. They're not going to be able to promote staff. They're not going to be able to have a culture because there won't be a company. So it's all about putting the customer at the heart. So when firms are designing products and services, or they're changing products and services, or they're looking to withdraw a product and service, understanding what does it mean for the customer. We are all customers.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
all are customers ourselves.
Yeah.
So think about how we would feel if we make a phone call to, say, our mobile phone provider and we receive very poor customer service, or we try to navigate onto a firm's website and everything's very clunky, the links aren't working, everything's slow, you get frustrated, or you're receiving lots of communication through your letterbox that's got nothing to do or relates to you in any way, shape, or form. So causing that customer harm, which the Consumer Duty wants to reduce and avoid, wants firms to reduce and avoid as much as possible. So it comes back to putting the customers at the heart of the business. It's about, and for that customer, let's face it, when you get good customer service, you have a good customer experience, you're more than likely to say to whoever, I phoned up this place, or I went into this shop, or I called up the bank, and this person I spoke to was so good. They listened to what I had to say. They made it. They followed through.
And
Yeah,
social media and all the other marketing stuff. Yeah, definitely.
absolutely. Because we know good news travels fast, but we know bad news travels fast. So when the customer has a bad experience, everyone's going to know about it. And these days with social media, everybody's putting it up on Insta, X, Facebook, etc., right? So I think whatever firms are doing, always thinking about the customer, putting them right in the middle. What's this? Oh, we're going to introduce this new product. How's it going to benefit the customer? What is the customer going to do? How long will the actual application take? What does it look like if a customer's applying for something on their phone versus on a laptop? If they call, there's so many things to think about. Think about the customer. Think about how you would feel, or how would your parents would feel, your spouse would feel, if they were engaging with your company that you're working with. So customer focus, and it's in every single FCA business plan. So can't get away from it.
Can't get away from it. Yeah, yeah. But when we started looking at the whole thing around consumer duty, we saw, because a big part of the work that we do is around ESG consulting, and we specialize in the S, so we write it little e, big S, little g, right? So our focus is around the social component, and we created this thing called the ESG social taxonomy, and one of the pillars of that is actually consumers or customers, right? And it's coming right back to everything that the duty speaks about, and what you mentioned a while ago, putting the customer at the heart. Are we producing goods and services that are harmful or beneficial to, are they harming the consumer, or are they a benefit to the consumer? Are we making sure that we're being transparent in the way how we label the stuff, and the legal fine print and all of that around it, right? So a lot of businesses should look at this from the standpoint of, if I get consumer duty right, I now have additional data that I can include in my ESG or social value or responsible business reporting, right? Because some of the biggest components in terms of reporting around ESG, and the regulation is changing rapidly right now. Even the FCA is coming up with more stuff around the S. Europe has the CSRD, the US is coming up with certain stuff. There are consultations now around changes to the Companies Act, Section 172. So companies are going to be driven to report a lot more on this. So, companies should see this as an opportunity to say, okay, yes, we need to have this ready for consumer duty in terms of the regulators, but there are going to be bigger needs for this kind of data, in terms of our ESG reporting, etc. So let's jump into the area of risk and compliance. How can businesses identify, and I would say mitigate, risks associated with non-compliance of the new consumer duty?
Well, every business should have, up-to-date risk registers, risk assessments. They should be conducting them regularly, we shall say. the frequency of that is to be determined by businesses. It's really important for businesses to look at what their control environment is, look at their risk strategy, see whether or not and I would think with the consumer duty, a lot of firms should have been doing that anyway. So, identifying their top risk, identifying their risk to consumers, redoing risk assessments, creating new risk assessments, looking at their controls, doing monitoring and testing, very, very key, testing various processes, and doing the root cause analysis to understand if there are any sort of trends or themes that are materializing that's impacting on customers, what needs to be done. So it's a continuation, looking at the policies, procedures, looking at frameworks, if there are, whether those existing frameworks need to be changed. So a whole plethora of things, looking at governance as well, looking at the reporting. So going back to what you were saying about reporting, as we know with the duty, the reporting and the MI that firms are using, the FCA are really going to be focusing on that. And as we know, the FCA relies on a lot from the various regulatory reporting submissions that firms have to make. They look at that data because it helps them to identify how firms are performing or not performing. Like in the duty, there's that constant reference to complaints data, but firms shouldn't just be relying on that. And to your point, we're looking at all the other data that they're collecting from customers on a regular basis, storing data, and using that to help them to inform them with their risk assessments and mitigations and controls and target risks and strategies and so forth. Very, very important. And if there's something that's not flagging up correctly, the FCA, they're going to zone down on it, and every report feeds into each other some way, shape or form. So the risk and compliance framework has to be really strong. You've got to have really strong risk and compliance teams, individuals that keep their knowledge up to date. Everything feeds in. And as you said, ESG, you've got DORA coming up next year, operational resilience, all that reporting, all that MI, risk, compliance, all feeds in some way.
So it feels like this doesn't really, because when you think about consumer duty, right? You see it, and especially it's like, coming from the FCA, the first thing you think of is, okay, the risk and compliance officer, the chief risk officer or the compliance team, they are the ones that really own this. But it's the responsibility seems to lie across the breadth of all the departments of the organization, right? Compliance, marketing, legal, company secretary, as far as governance is concerned. Like, are you kind of seeing that as well?
What I'm seeing is that compliance is the one that seems to be doing it literally 90% or even more. I feel like, especially being in compliance for a long time, and I know a lot of compliance officers would agree, the business always feel, compliance should do it. No, that's not what we should. We are there to help, guide, provide oversight, challenge. But a lot from what I've seen again through going to various, meetings, a lot of compliance professionals have been the one that have been tasked with implementing the duty, have been tasked with creating the consumer duty board assessment, where it should be the various business teams, marketing, tech, customer services, product teams, research teams. They should be the one that's feeding in and doing a lot of the writing, putting the pen to paper. But it's been, a lot of it had to fall on the compliance professionals. So again, going back to one of my earlier points, where you've maybe got those smaller firms that don't have that resource, they haven't got a person or a team who's been able to be dedicated to implement a duty. That's will obviously been a challenge for them, and maybe the ones that haven't quite yet finished or fully implemented.
Okay, yeah. I mean, we've seen that as well. Where I was at a roundtable discussion with chief risk officers a few weeks ago, and they're pretty much overwhelmed. And the fact is that a lot of them don't understand some of the other stuff that happens in some of the other departments, right? So it's like, how am I going to be writing in terms of, okay, how do we change our marketing strategy so that it aligns with the new consumer duty? Because one of them said to me that I'm not a marketer, so I can pitch in and I can give some tips, but it's the marketing department that needs to own that. Even when it comes down to the board assessment, that should be the COSEC's responsibility with the input from the compliance to say, here are some of the questions that you need to ask, but the COSEC is the person that needs to kind of own that. Earlier in your conversation, you mentioned technology. So what are some of the tools and technologies that can support businesses in this compliance effort as far as the duty is concerned? Are there any out there, or is just like you just have to use existing stuff?
I think, firms can definitely make use of their own internal systems, database platforms that they've got. And there's obviously so many, but there are so many other compliance management framework platforms out there. You would have seen, obviously, since Consumer Duty has come in, there's been various firms who I'm trying to think of at least one who are offering their services, offering, some sort of program that is able to capture the data and pull this data from that data to make this nice report. You can do these filters and things like. So there's loads of companies that are promoting their services as to which one companies to choose to go with. Obviously, they have to make that decision. Then, as I talked about before, you've got the use of AI as well. So I feel with those technology and those solutions that businesses, if they've got the money and they've got the resources, and if it fits in with their overall strategy, that they can help to utilize that as well. But I think businesses will try and test and see what works. I think maybe a lot of businesses will stick with what they've got internally because, everything is about cost, and then see as things go on, because obviously there's been a lot of businesses that have commissioned external consultants, agencies who, again, they've got their own templates, their own data, and let's face it, it's quite a lot of money, right? So yeah, it's interesting, but there are those tools out there, but it's going to be down to businesses as to what works for them. Or some businesses maybe have tools that they maybe they're using it for one particular thing, and then they've realized, oh, we can utilize this to help the consumer duty. Yeah.
The reporting is what is on, is one side, but the other thing as well is, so the reporting, let's call it like the downstream. That's like the output that's required.
Yeah.
And there's all of this upstream stuff, starting with the whole notion around, as the duty calls it, transparent communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
And why is this transparent communication so important for under the new regulations?
Well, the word transparent, what does that mean? It means my definition, being clear, isn't it? Being clear, you can literally see through. There's no ambiguity, that word in it. It's it's not open to the wrong interpretation. Communication itself. Businesses are communicating with customers every single day in so many ways, shapes, through email, through web chat, through phone, through websites. It's really important that
terms and conditions.
Conditions, the technical jargon. Exactly. And let's face it, there's a lot of people out there that do not read terms and conditions. They will only read it when something goes wrong. Then they will be quoting back to that organization. Paragraph 1.2.3 says whatever it says, so. And let's face it, with terms and conditions, you can only kind of, I don't know, dumb it down, for want of a better phrase, because there's certain things, certain requirements that terms and conditions have to hold. So, but you want to make sure that communications, that they flow. The FCA talks about in the duty that communication should be sent out to customers, the right information at the right time, that it should be accurate. Nobody likes to be bombarded with emails, posts, phone calls. So it's about testing the communication, we're going to send out communication. What does that impact mean? What would that mean for a customer? Is it the right communication? Is it containing the right amount of information to help customers to make those informed choices if they want to join, sign up, subscribe to, purchase a product and or a service? So transparent communications is what it says on the tin, being transparent, being to the point, being very clear. And sometimes you will still get customers that will read something and they may interpret it differently, but that's where that support element, where they know that they can call up a firm, that they can make inquiries, you know.
And the firms are, and when they call up the firms aren't reading them the same thing that's in the contract or in the letter that they don't understand. Like someone to just kind of say, okay, this is how I break it down, X, Y, and Z. It's a perfect example. Me was I was having an issue with EE, and you know, I traveled abroad. When I came back, my phone bill was sky high, and you know, I called them up and I'm like, what's going on? And the young man was, he just went through stuff point by me, and he's like, look, your terms and conditions says X, Y, and Z, but this is what it means, right? And he was able to kind of take, and I was so impressed. I was just like flabbergasted. And when they sent me the text message to say, you know, how do you rate? I just gave 10 because he was just so good in terms of
Yes.
like, you know, and that's what I think being transparent in terms of the communication kind of means as well. We're talking about communication. How does this then aligns to things like GDPR, or does it align to things like GDPR?
Well, absolutely, because data, as I was talking about before, companies, firms hold so much customer data. They have a responsibility under the Data Protection Act 2018 to be storing, holding, managing data in very stringent ways, having really strong control frameworks around, you know, who, for example, within an organization has access to data, the types of data that's held, and the length of time, and knowing that customers, as we as customers can, you know, request a subject access request, put in subject access request to understand what data is being held about us. So, yeah, the holding of data, the processing of data, it all goes hand in hand in terms of, you know, doing for firms to be doing the right things, managing customer data sufficiently, protecting it, because you're putting the customer at the heart of the business. You hear so many stories of late where organizations or officials or senior people from organizations leave a laptop on the train, they leave paperwork with customer data, with technology constantly evolving, you know, in terms of systems being compromised, getting hold of customer data. So it's super important, you know, how we are holding data, the privacy, you know, because when customers are calling up businesses to talk about whatever product or service, being able to identify that customer before you're sharing any data in regards to whatever that customer's called up to talk about, etc. So there's that cross transference. So there's a responsibility on customers, but there's also a responsibility on firms. So absolutely, data privacy is, and it's not going away. And I think the more and more the way technology is evolving and AI, etc., is the more firms have to do a lot to make sure they're protecting the data that they're holding, that they're storing it for the required amount of time in
Yeah.
the right way.
Yeah. Is this something that is mandated under the duty in terms of like data protection or anything like that? Because I'm assuming that, you know, one of the things that might come out of the implementation of this duty is more data from the customer, or, you know, so I'm just curious.
I think from the top of my head, I'm just trying to remember. I think they mentioned it, but it's mentioned quite lightly in terms of data. I don't feel the duty focuses on it. It's more of an inference that in dealing with customers and in terms of across the four outcomes, that's going to automatically filter into it. But what I would say is that now that we've had the final deadline, no doubt there'll be more guidance that does come out, as I said, in regards to how we're handling, how the firms are expected to handle customer data. But I'm just trying, I know there's like references, for example, like the Equalities Act, you know, but like in terms of data protection, I think it's quite light from the top, from memory. I'm literally trying to scan the actual consumer handbook in my brain. So I'm trying to, you know, but I believe it goes hand in hand, you know. I said, you know, in terms of consumer understanding, consumer support, products and services, data, is firms should have, and it goes back to the principles of business point that I talked about at the very beginning about firms when they are authorized, licensed, that they sign up to these principles of business, which means about maintaining, having adequate systems and controls in place. That's going to include data that's being held, you know, and
Yes,
it,
yes.
so everything is intertwined. So even though sometimes the FCA might be slightly silent on something, it doesn't mean that firms will just think, well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to take that into consideration. You know, everything overlaps
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form, I would say.
Yeah, especially with those regulations already existing, right? I
Yes.
mean, I think it would be kind of helpful if you can to kind of, share like an example of a business that you've worked with without calling names, maybe just, the industry, and, share some successes, like, where were they, and then what are some of the things that they did, and then like some of the successes that they're seeing, if any comes to mind.
I would say try and keep this as general as possible.
Yes.
I would say that in the beginning, which was however long ago, that there was only a small percentage of people that had even heard of consumer duty. And then at the end, or halfway through, they got to not only know what consumer duty is, they was able to understand the consumer duty, its rules and requirements and implications, not just on the firm, but also on them as an individual and within the teams that they work with. And then that's had people coming up to me if they're doing something, whether it's from a marketing perspective. So they're going to put out some sort of financial promotional material, or they're looking at a product designer like Dane. So, in the consumer duty. So I started, so when I'm hearing that and it's making me feel good. Cause I'm like, they've
Yeah.
listened to me, they've taken it in. That's, yeah. And that's what has been really, really like enlightening. And it goes towards that culture. And it's just like, yeah, but then, in the consumer duty, or we've had this query from a consumer duty point, would be able to do that, or we're looking to do X, Y, and Z, but from a consumer duty, could we get your thoughts? Could we get your input? Could you review this document? So as
Yes.
opposed to me going
Right.
to teams, I've had individuals coming up to me, messaging
Right.
me, emailing
Right.
me, and saying, Dane, da, 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 da. But from a consumer duty point, would this be okay? Would this be sufficient? That shows you that they're thinking about it.
Thinking. Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah. And that's
That's
what I would
great.
say.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's exactly what you want to see happening, right? Yes,
Yes.
without a doubt. That's when you
Yeah.
know that, my work here was not in vain.
Absolutely. And also it might kind of be a little bit sad, but every time someone says consumer duty, they think of me. I'm like, oh my gosh. Consumer duty day, consumers like, because I'm always talking about it. If I'm in a meeting about something, it could be anything. I'm like, yeah, but from a consumer duty standpoint, and they're like, okay, yes, yeah, we need to take that in consideration. Or you're
Yeah,
seeing references to consumer duty in documentation. You're like, this is good. It's
yeah.
sticky, like you said. Yeah,
I
and it can
when
only
you
get
know
better.
really, really one is when less and less people start coming to you and you are seeing it kind of becoming part of BAU, right? In the business.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
what potential future developments can you see in the consumer duty protection regulations? Like if you're someone that has worked with the FCA and other regulatory bodies, like if you were to do like a horizon scanning, where do you think that this will go, or what are some of the further impacts that you think that this might be having?
Think it's definitely going to keep growing to the FCA's sentence that they say it's not a once and done exercise. I feel like as we're talking about with Dora coming in next year, you're going to see it more in that space. AI, where AI is constantly evolving. Obviously, the FCA are still getting their head around AI. It's definitely going to creep into there. So some of the sort of newer technologies or evolving technologies is going to continue to grow. I feel one of the things the FCA was saying on this 1 year on webinar the other day is that they're going to be doing a review in a couple of years, but a couple of years, they didn't say when. So it's going to be useful to see what comes out of that. But I feel like the consumer duty this is only kind of the beginning. You know, when you think back from July 2022, we're 2 years in, there's been a lot of lessons learned. There's been a lot of insights the FCA shared. There's been a lot of surveys. And I feel, and there's even been talk as well about the FCA developing some sort of regulatory reporting around consumer duty. So in addition to, you know, companies having to submit regulatory reports on complaints, fraud, etc. Because, for example, you've got the APP fraud scam. There's something that's coming in very shortly. What firms are having to work through. So it's all. I feel consumer duty touches on so many different areas across financial services. So it's going to, as I said, you're not going to be able to get away from it. The FCA are reaching out to firms constantly, asking them what they've done, how they've implemented it. So it's going to continue to grow. AML, we know, is such a growing area with the regulations. So yeah, it's everywhere. You're never not going to not hear consumer duty ever again. It's here to stay.
And how can businesses stay ahead of these changes and, you know, in it and the ever evolving kind of regulatory landscape, which we all know is coming?
I think it's really important to have the right people in your organization, the right compliance professionals. Horizon scanning is very, very important. You know, some firms use different horizon scanning tools. Really having those conversations, really keeping up to date what developments are, attending those roundtables, you know, really keeping abreast, understanding, reviewing your internal policies and processes, and just staying up to date. Attending those FCA webinars, you know, looking at, there's a lot of consultations that are coming up, being able to even take part in those consultations. And I think that's what it is. With the UK, I think we're one of the most heavily regulated countries in the world, right? So it's important as a compliance professional that you're keeping up to date. You know what's coming around the corner, and being able to bring it to the attention of the business that you're working in, to understand and be able to assess the potential impacts. Like DORA was announced 2 years ago. It's only a few months away, right? So when you're doing horizon scanning, you're able to almost try and predict what's going to happen, what businesses need to do, maybe what systems they need to put in place, maybe what teams do they need to create, what do they need to review their governance. So it's just trying to stay on top of everything and have these types of conversations. You've got to keep the conversation going. That's really important. Keep the conversation going. Ask those difficult questions. Ask the difficult questions in the business. That's what we do as compliance. We ask those difficult questions, those challenging questions.
Although a lot of times people don't like us for asking those difficult questions.
Absolutely, right? They don't. They get defensive.
I know.
They get defensive, but we that's what we are there to, because at the end of the day, when we're there, we're working together. It's not a them or it's not a we or them or us. We're all working together. And I always say to firms, it's better that we, the compliance professionals in the organization, are asking those questions than the regulator. Because once the regulator becomes involved, they ask a question, they ask another question, they follow up with another question, then they say they want to do a visit or a phone call, then a phone call turns to a visit, then a visit lasts from 1 day to 2 days to 1 week to 2 weeks. So really aren't having those difficult conversations and challenging for the right reasons, and within that continue to educate and empower. You know, so with the consumer duty, it's not like, we've trained everybody, that's it. It's that continuation, that refresher training about consumer duty, new staff that are coming in saying, this is the consumer duty, this is how it applies to you, what you do, this is what you should be having in mind. Any questions, you know, creating that open forum so people can ask questions without fear.
Yes, or judgment, definitely. And once you see the regulators start saying, we're doing a consultation, take note, because that consultation does not mean it is not coming. It means it is coming. We just want to hear what you guys have to say, you know.
Absolutely. And I really feel during this time with the consumer duty, the FCA have been, going back to using your words, transparent with their communication, where they've shared a lot of insights on their website, where they've done surveys with firms. So for example, out of the 4 outcomes, the price and value one, they said, is the one that they have found firms are struggling the most with, and they're going to be doing some more work around that area. You know, the consumer support, consumer understanding is kind of almost like that's easy too, right? And products and services. But the price and fair value one, they said, has been the one that, yeah, businesses have found the most tricky, but they're going to be doing some more work. And they've been sharing insights around, you know, the outcomes, what they've seen, and the various webinars and podcasts. So there has been a lot of information out there. And I think firms need to make sure that they've re-reviewed it, they really understand it, and that they're also feeding up to their boards, right? So that consumer duty champion, bringing it up to the board, making sure the board are really aware of any potential challenges on the sort of ground below, so to speak, in terms of implement or products and services and considerations not being considered, and bringing it up to the board to say to the board, we're looking to do this as an organization, but from a consumer duty standpoint, there are concerns, and the board being able to, you know, have that oversight and, you know, make whatever decisions so it can filter down. So it's really important.
You mentioned, and I had that question here to ask, and it kind of slipped because, and I'm happy you brought up the whole notion of the board again, because one of the things you mentioned earlier on is the fact that organizations needed to appoint a consumer duty champion at the board level. How important is the board's role and responsibility in consumer duty and the implementation of it?
Is super critical. It's so important, right? Because when you think of it, the board is at the top. Then you've got the other workers below.
The
So
senior leadership, and then you
yeah,
have
the senior leadership team, yeah, who are the ones, yeah, who are in that position to be making really key decisions, directing where a firm is going to go next, in the next year, in the next 2 years. So the board needs to have that understanding and that awareness, because when you think about the senior managers and certificate regime, you know, and the responsibility that senior managers have in regards to what they do, but that it's about that accountability, right? It's accountability. And so the FCA will, you know, can speak to boards and say, well, you know, have you been aware of what's been happening? Have you had any update? What challenges, what decisions have you made? How have you directed the business or a business department? So the board are very, very critical. It's not just about the workers, those that are not on the board. It's the culture that comes from the board down, and it also goes up. So they need to be really informed and be along the whole journey, not be removed from it. They have to be very, So they are very, very important.
Because the board, you know, as we've always said, because we do lots of work in governance, the board, they are the custodian of the culture of the organization. And if culture is so important in terms of getting consumer duty right, then they have to ensure that it's implemented. They have to ensure that that culture permeates. What's the role of the board champion, the consumer duty board champion?
They're there to.
Sometimes we see this on boards, and people are like, oh, I'm the ESG champion, or I'm the diversity inclusion champion. And you're like, what you do? You know,
what does that actually mean?
Yeah, what does that actually mean? Is that just a title you need to add?
Yeah,
you're not a title of non-exec director, like. What should the consumer duty champion at the board level, what should they do? What are
they need to be a very proactive individual. They need to be the one that's pulling together the updates, that they're sharing the updates of what's happening on the ground below, so to speak, what's been happening across the business, what challenges have there been in terms of implementation, what has changed, what's been updated, what's been introduced, and then bringing that to the board and challenging and discussing with the board and being able to challenge them and influence. So it needs to be a person that's got that influence. It's not just, oh, I'm a consumer board champion and that's it. They've got to be proactive, promoting the duty, making sure that the duty is on the agenda every single month or quarter.
They get, for example, you as a chief compliance officer in the business responsible for consumer duty. Should they be making sure that they touch base with you monthly, quarterly? What should they actually be doing apart from the reporting, some of the other tactical kind of stuff?
I would definitely say being very proactive. So you're engaging a lot with compliance. to understand. So it's not like, oh, board's on Monday, what's been happening like today? You know? No, no.
We know that's how some of them operate, right? The board
Absolutely
meeting on
right.
Monday,
Yeah,
Sunday night they call in and say, "Hey,
yeah. It's like what midday? Can you give me a download? No, it's them. It should be. There should be regular conversations happening. Has that whether it's every fortnight, every month, depending on how often the board is. You know, so and that they should be able to be proactive and making a change and following up. They should be doing stuff like in a tangent with the compliance professionals, well, to make sure things are being pushed forward and then being able to present an overview of this is what's been happening from a duty perspective. This is what's been implemented, enhanced, this is introduced, etc. Training's been done or whatever it is. So they've got a lot of involvement. I would say, though, in my various roles, I've often been called, and I can actually, and I'm going to accept it, that I have been the consumer duty champion, even though, just in terms of, even though, yes, I'm in compliance, I'm doing what I'm doing in terms of helping with implementation, etc. But I actually have been the consumer duty champion because I've been living, breathing, eating, sleeping consumer duty, educating, training, creating frameworks, etc. So that's what the consumer duty champion should be doing, not necessarily compliance doing it all. But as we spoke about before, that kind of seems to be the way it is. But yeah, the champion needs to be of significant influence, being able to influence the board, influence those decisions, challenge the board as well. Where the board, because you could argue maybe in some organisations maybe quite far removed from what's actually happening, outside of that boardroom, being able to bring it to them and if they've got questions, say, give them that complete picture and provide that challenge to the board and get the board to make a decision. Let's face it, the board are the one that have to approve the consumer duty board assessment report. But the board hasn't written it. It's been written by the consumer duty champion, right? So, and a board
champion in the business, yes. But the
in
board,
the business.
the non-exec director on the board, who is also the board consumer duty champion, has to get involved and know what is going in that report and input in that report as well, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the engagement should not just be with the people in compliance. They should be talking to the marketing people, the people in HR, the people, to get a full understanding. Because the person, as a non-exec director, on some boards, like if you talk to one person, you're just hearing that person's perspective.
Yes.
And that person is only going to want to tell you what they want you to hear, right?
Yeah.
That they would ensure that they're doing stuff. So you have to widen your engagement,
Absolutely. Which is why I can see why everybody's called me the consumer duty champion, because I speak to everybody. I'm that person. Here comes Dane. Yes, hi. Yes, yes, that's what compliance do. You got to ask the questions. As I was saying,
it's so important that you mentioned the fact that, I started out the question by asking about the board consumer duty champion, but there needs to be an operational consumer duty champion, which might not necessarily have to be the chief compliance officer or even someone in compliance. You know what I mean? It's someone who has that, who have the political skills to kind of move within the different departments and get people, have the influence to kind of change the culture and change the way how things work, right? That could be someone compliance, but it does not necessarily have to be, right? It could be the CEO, it could be the chief people officer, it could be, somebody else in the organization that has that ability in terms of doing that, So
you can make it a collaboration between, for example, two very senior people. So there's not a prescribed way, but
I've seen organizations that have like a what do they call it? A consumer duty collective. So it's like, a group of individuals from different departments, and they meet like weekly, and they just kind of come up with a strategy, and they all move in the same direction. They speak the same language, and this was a very large insurance company. So they needed more than one person to kind of help to kind of, get the message going.
I may even think I know who you're talking about. That sounds very familiar. And I think that's really a really good idea because,
Yeah.
especially, okay, we've just literally had the deadline for the first consumer board assessment. But as we know, it's going to be every year, right? So if
Yeah.
you've got those collectives, those forums or whatever that are meeting on a regular basis, looking at the MI, being able to analyze the MI to understand the types of outcomes that are being produced and defining it under each of the four outcomes, the support, the understanding, products and services and price and fair value, understanding what remediation needs to be done, what needs to be changed. If you're doing that on a regular basis, by the time that year comes around, you've got all your information. You've got all your data, you've got all your root cause, you've got all your mitigation, you've got your overall strategy. It's there as opposed to we've done it for this year, thank God. Let's just leave that and then we'll look at it again next year.
I'm probably start looking at it like 3 months before the deadline, and you start
Exactly. So that's really good. And as I said, some firms, I know I've heard of some firms where they've got various governance and risk committees. They've literally just, added that consumer duty lens, that individuals have into the existing ones. But then, as you said, some have actually created separate committees and forums as well. So there's no right or necessarily wrong way to do it, but it's keeping the conversation going. It's not just, oh, we've done it now, thank God, and just hope for the best. It's a forever thing. I've said to a lot of people, it's forever. It's not a once and done exercise. Consumer duty is here to stay. Long as you are a financial service firm, you're doing financial services, you're caught in it. You can't just park it and look at it sometime later. No.
I mean, we're coming towards, the wrap up, and I think we're leading into the whole notion of like, one of the things we really love to do when we're kind of ending, these conversations is like, coming up with some practical tips and advice for business leaders and experts, in this case, in terms of, adapting, this regulation. And we just discussed one of those key one, which is around there's no right or wrong way of implementing it or coming up with champions, right? It's what suits your organization and
absolutely.
Right? What are some of the other practical advice that you would give to business leaders and experts who are either on the journey or looking to start the journey? If you don't start the journey yet, boy, I'm telling you.
That part is hard. If you haven't started the journey, you need to start today.
I know.
That's what I would say. Yes.
As my Jamaican grandmother would say, dog, yam your supper. If you haven't
absolutely. So if you haven't started the journey, you need to start now.
Okay, that's number one advice.
That's like number one. You need to, if you haven't for some reason done your implementation plan or even updated it or looked at it for a long time, you need to go back and look at it. Don't just bury and think it's going to go away. Also make use, there's so much resources. There's been so many firms have written so much about the consumer duty, the top big four accountancy. There's a lot of information out there. So make use of that information out there to help you to understand how you should perhaps maybe be looking at how you do your product value assessments.
The FCA has tons of information.
They've got a section for firms, and read, and also having the right people to help to push and drive the consumer duty, to have those. So whether or not you have to recruit or you have to train within or you have to engage with external, it's a worthwhile investment, because at the end of the day, it comes back to the customer, right? The customer at the heart of your business. That's what the FCA wants to see. The reason they brought the duty into existence in the first place is because of so much of the bad practices and bad experiences that they were hearing that customers were continuously having, and things like COVID, the cost of living crisis, all those sorts of things, exacerbates the situation, and they want firms to be doing a lot better than they have. There's been some firms that are just in it for the money. They're, so many scams and customers and losing money, vulnerability. There's so much. So the duty's been brought in to make firms sit up to say, no more. You've got to do better. You can do better. So firms really need to be reminding themselves it's about the customer. If they haven't started, start today. If they haven't got the staff, recruit the staff. If they can't recruit the staff, engage external. Look at the resources that are out there. Reach out to Lumerous. Reach out,
Yep.
engage. Engage. Don't bury your head in the sand, because it's not going to go away. Because when the FCA comes knocking on the door, you're like, oh wait, the excuses are not going to
Gonna fly.
watch well. Yeah, they're not going to watch well with the FCA. One thing I know, having worked at the FCA, and they always say that they know there's no one size that fits all, but they want to know that firms have tried, that firms have really sat down and thought about the duty, the rules and requirements, and looked at their business model, looked at their products, and looked at what needs to be done, what can be done. And if there's things that haven't been done, but there's that clear roadmap, they're not going to tell you, they're not going to be like, well, oh, okay. They can see that there's been clear, rational thinking, engagement with the key business teams, the board. If they can feel that, then it's going to go a lot better where if they don't see anything.
Yeah. I think firms just need to just remember that, it's, don't try and eat the elephant all at once, right? It might look overwhelming and a lot of stuff, because when I read this first, I was like, oh my God. But when you start, as you say, when you build a roadmap, when you kind of plan it out and start putting things, okay, this is what we're going to do first, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do that, right? It's, just small bite chunks. And if the FCA see you kind of making progression and you have a plan, they'll work with you. They'll work with you because they know that everybody is in a different space.
Absolutely.
It's as I would say to a lot of our clients, I'm like, it's a Mo Farah. It's not a Usain Bolt. So in other words, it's like,
I like that one.
it's not a sprint, right? So let's pace it. Let's pace it, right? Let's pace it.
Yeah, and keep the conversations open. Keep engaging with your stakeholders internally. Keep it open. Ask the questions. Ask the questions. Don't know. There's in reality, there's not really no such thing as a silly question with a duty. Ask the question. You'd be surprised at the answer. Don't make assumptions. Ask it. Work through it. Collaborate. The things that we should be doing as well. And firms that work with other firms, it's about the sharing of information, because lots of firms share many of the same customers in different stages across that distribution chain that duty applies to, right?
Yeah, definitely. Man, I love this conversation because you know how passionate I am about these things. Just like you. So we could be here forever, but I know how
I know.
Yeah, and it's a Friday and it's nice and sunny outside. So
I know, makes a change, right?
I know. I'm gonna go out in the garden and just finish up the rest of the day out there doing some work. So as we wrap up today's discussion on navigating the new UK consumer duty, it's clear that while this regulation presents significant challenges, it also offers lots of unique opportunities that you mentioned, Dana, for businesses to elevate their customer relations and drive sustainable growth and sustainable change as well, right? As I mentioned earlier, I can see where this pins directly into things around social impact and social value, which is a huge thing as part of ESG, but also the whole notion of social justice. A lot of consumers are concerned about the way how they're treated and the goods and services that they're being offered. So as businesses, you just need to embrace these changes, but embrace them as Dana mentioned, from a proactive standpoint, right? And you also need to make sure that you bring a strategic approach, and don't look at it just as only ensuring compliance, but see it as a way of setting a new standard for excellence and consumer engagement, and just being a force for good as business. As we say at Lumerous, being good is better for business, full stop, right? And it's important to, just as I mentioned earlier, to recognize that it's a journey, right? It's a journey. So one step at a time, right? I'll always channel my Jamaican grandmother when she say one cocoa full basket. It means like, one at a time, you put stuff in, right? So I hope this conversation has, with Dana has provided you. Well, I'm not hope. I know this conversation with Dana has provided you with some amazing, valuable insights and, some practical strategies to turn the regulations into one that will give you a competitive advantage, right? I want to just extend, boy, Dana, big up. I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to you for taking the time out of your business schedule to kind of share your expertise and bring this critical topic to light. I don't think I would, and that's why I waited, because I know if anyone could bring justice to this, it's you, right? So I'm gonna invite you back to do a webinar for on this topic to our
Absolutely. I would love to. Lumos, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. It's been really great to be able to speak to you about the topic of consumer duty, and and to hear your passion for the customer as much as myself as well. And just the note to the businesses, like there's a lot of businesses out there that you all are doing great work already, right? So when you look at the duty is just reinforcing all the great work that you're doing, and it's just shining the light on maybe those areas that you maybe kind of fallen down on a little bit, and you just need to pull them up and revise and review and enhance. So I just want to say that to businesses doing a lot of great work already. So it's continue to build on that, and and you'll be fine. And our customers, and when you've got great customers and we businesses keep customers, then the customer loyalty goes on for years and years and years, right? So yeah.
And word of mouth is the most powerful, right? So if you'd like to learn more about consumer duty and how as a business you can get this implemented in your business, or if you have challenges in integrating the principles of consumer duty into your business operation, whether it's monitoring or measuring or reporting or, putting the policies in place, well, as Dana said before, contact us at Lumos at enquiries@lumos.com, or you can visit us on our website. Dana is one of our expert leaders, so you'll be in really, really great hands in terms of getting this right for your organization, right? You can also find us on, all the socials, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Medium, at Lumos PLC. And of course, if you'll be listening to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform. So, please follow us, subscribe, like us, share, but also, share your comments as well. Know what you think. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. We're more than happy. We always respond to those questions. So that's all we have for this episode for the Leadership Melting Pot. Thank you for tuning in. And as usual, before I go, I'd like to really acknowledge the Lumos team behind the scenes, Perpetual, Deborah, and Benjamin from marketing, who are responsible for pulling our podcast together. So thank you guys very much. The Leadership Melting Pot is a podcast of Lumos, and Lumos is a social impact management consultancy. So, all right, folks, thanks. Until next time, sending you love and gratitude.